Welcome to Peace Puzzles Season 2, Preparing to Negotiate Peace. I'm Katie from PILPG, and in this season, we're diving into the critical steps you should take before stepping into peace negotiations. In today's episode, as in many, we'll hear from Nicole Carle, Counsel at PILPG, and founder and president Dr. Paul R. Williams. And they'll be exploring why establishing rules and procedures is such an important skill to have. Let's get started.
Getting right into it, what do we mean when we say rules and procedures for a negotiation process?
Nicole, just like there are laws of war, there are rules by which parties conduct an armed conflict, you also need rules for a negotiation. A negotiation is essentially the parties trying to accomplish in a negotiation room or at a negotiation venue what they weren't able to accomplish on the battlefield. Negotiations are chaotic, they are intense, they are emotional, and they're basically the party's best hope to bring an end to the conflict and ideally establish a durable peace. And so with all of these pressures, with all of these dimensions of a negotiation, you basically have to have some ground rules for how you're going to conduct these negotiations. Otherwise, it'll just be perpetual chaos.
Now, why might parties sometimes take this initiative to propose such rules and procedures?
There's two sets of rules and procedures that we can look at. One would be the rules and procedures that a party uses internally for its own delegation. And then the second would be rules and procedures that govern the interaction among the parties. And those are oftentimes proposed by the mediators, but we can talk a little bit later about why a party strategically might want to put the rules for the negotiations on the table. But first, let's talk about why does an internal delegation have rules and procedures? And oftentimes if it's the government or if it's the army or the armed actor, they'll have a chain of command and they'll already have a code of conduct or a code of behavior within their delegation. But if it's a civilian delegation or if it's a delegation which brings together a number of parties that are in opposition to the government or even a civil society delegation, we're seeing more of those in parties. Oftentimes what happens in the internal delegation room is as if not more chaotic, more intense than what happens in the bilateral or the multilateral negotiating venue or the negotiating room. Now, in order for parties to be able to effectively negotiate, they need to maintain that cohesion within their delegation. How does the delegation prepare and agree upon proposals that will be put on the table? Who can put those proposals on the table? Who can speak to the media? Who can speak in the delegation room? These are all very simple questions, but they are intensely emotional and can disrupt the flow of a delegation's engagement in the peace process. So every delegation that I've ever worked for, the first thing they do is they sit down and they write up 4 or 5 pages of rules that govern the delegation itself so they can then be positioned to effectively negotiate with the opposing party.
So it seems really intuitive and natural for parties to want to establish these rules and procedures for themselves. Now, instead, I want to ask, why might a mediator propose certain rules and procedures as well?
Initially, a mediator would put some rules and procedures on the table because she'd want to create a framework within which she's going to conduct the mediation so that she has a sense of predictability. How long will the mediation last each day? Where will the parties sit? And we can talk about some of the specifics of that, but basically a framework so that her expectations are clear, to the parties make clear their expectations. But also importantly, it's moderately easy to negotiate rules and procedures. It's difficult to negotiate security sector reform, power sharing, wealth sharing, the state structure. But if you can start with something where you're negotiating with the parties about the rules and procedures, you can build momentum for the negotiation of substantive issues. You can build a degree of trust among the parties, just a light degree of trust. But you can also get a sense of the negotiating style of the parties. Are they going to be conciliatory? Are they going to be assertive? Are they going to be aggressive? Are they going to seek to destabilize the process? Because you're just negotiating rules of procedure, but it's an actual negotiation. And so it gives the negotiator a preview of how the parties are going to approach the negotiations.
Really interesting. So we've covered what rules and procedures are, who might be establishing them. I'd like to get into some examples and really get a sense of what we're talking about. To begin with, can you share a few examples of what a procedural rule might look like?
Yeah. So the procedural rules are very mundane, but they help to keep the flow of the negotiations moving forward, and they help to minimize extraneous irritations for the parties. So if they agree upon, right, how are documents exchanged? Do all documents have to go through the mediator, or can the parties exchange them bilaterally? Is there a secretariat where each document is dated, coded with a particular unique identifying number? So there's a sense of how material is exchanged. Is it that only the mediator can put documents on the table in the room, and the parties have to give it to the mediator, and then the mediator works to decide whether it goes into the room or not? What are the timing of the negotiation sessions? Oftentimes they go into the wee hours of the morning, but you'll want to have a sense of what the timing, because every negotiation is three-dimensional chess. You're negotiating with the party across the table, but each delegation needs time amongst themselves to negotiate and to craft their position. And then you need time for the mediator to do some bilateral chatting with the parties. So you want to know what the day is going to look like. Who translates the documents? Are the documents translated? Who translates them? What's an authoritative translation? Who keeps the draft of what's being decided and what's being discussed? Is it the mediator? Is there a particular person on the mediator's team? Are each party, are they responsible for keeping their own minutes of the negotiations? And even some things as simple but important as the shape of the table. Is it a triangle? Is it a circle? Is it a U-shaped table? Is it a rectangle? Is it a square? And who gets to sit at the table? Who speaks first? All very simple things, but these are practical procedural rules that the parties need to agree upon with the mediator in order to reduce what it will otherwise be a highly chaotic process. Nicole, there's also a couple of external rules that fall into this category of procedural rules. Confidentiality. Is what happens in the negotiation room confidential? Are the documents which are shared or proposed, are they confidential? No. Who can speak to the press? If the mediator is going to do a press release, do the parties have to agree on the content of that press release? How the mediation parties and mediator interact with the external environment. You also need a set of basic rules for that.
That is so much to consider before we even get into the substance of the negotiations and the agreement themselves. Anything else that parties have to agree on before they go into the negotiations, such as a code of conduct or any behavioral rules?
Yeah, oftentimes there will be behavioral rules. In addition to the procedural rules, there is oftentimes a behavioral code of conduct. The first principle or the first rule is we're all here to negotiate in good faith. That may or may not be true, but at least you want to put that as the first behavioral code of conduct principle, negotiating good faith. You'll also want to highlight the need for mutual respect. And bear in mind, these are parties that have been fighting it out on the battlefield. And oftentimes these conflicts are accompanied by atrocity crimes. You have to, in a sense, leave it on the field or leave it in the parking lot. And as you move into the negotiation venue, you have to do it in good faith. You have to be respectful of each other. Oftentimes, the mediators will request that the parties use formal titles when interacting with each other. They may want to go for an informal first name basis, but in some cultures and with some parties, they may find that offensive. By using the formal titles, you create some level of parity. And then simple behavioral code of conduct promptness. If you want to undermine the flow of the negotiation, and if you want to annoy another party, you show up half an hour late to the round of the negotiation because your time is more valuable than their time and then the mediator's time. Right? I've seen negotiations that come under substantial strain because one party is being disrespectful of the other party by simply showing up late. And the principle of the code of conduct is promptness. It's one of those ways of showing respect.
So it sounds like there might be a lot of rules and procedures to follow for the course of the negotiations. I'm really curious if there are consequences for breaking rules and how parties might come to that.
Yeah, oftentimes there really aren't consequences to breaking the rules other than it begins to erode the ability of the mediator to manage the mediation. And the mediator doesn't have to be there. The parties have to be there. They're trying to bring an end to the armed conflict. They're trying to bring peace to their country, sort out a social contract, or moving their country forward. And the mediator is there to help facilitate that. And the mediator, she puts forward rules of procedure and rules of behavior. And if the parties don't follow them, there's no sanction that the mediator can impose upon the parties, but it does actually erode the ability to get to yes and to design a durable peace agreement. Occasionally, folks will try to put in punishments into these rules of procedures and behavioral principles, but that's not what they're designed for. You're getting together for mediation and you're like, right, so what are the rules of the game and how is this going to work? And you design these to be as efficient and equitable as they can be.
Going back to the creating the rules and agreeing on them, what happens if the parties simply can't agree on a particular set of rules?
I've actually seen this happen. And if the parties can't agree on a set of rules, they're probably not going to be able to agree on a peace agreement either. So it's a really good indication of ripeness. One of the theories in peace negotiations is the conflict has to be ripe in order for the parties to reach an agreement on a durable peace. Spending a couple of days trying to lay out the framework, the process of the negotiation, the rules, the code of conduct. If the parties can't agree upon that, it's a really good sign that the conflict is not ripe. And it's a lot better to delay the negotiations at that stage of, okay, we got together for a pre-negotiation conversation and it turns out the negotiations weren't right. Rather than to kick off the negotiations and 3 or 4 days into the negotiations, realize the parties aren't agreeing on anything. This really isn't ripe for a negotiation. So it's a nice little way of testing out where the negotiation process is and the willingness of the parties to negotiate. So look, if you can't agree on the rules or procedure, it's not a failure. It actually just tells you delay the negotiations until a time where they can actually be effective.
It's true. Timing really is everything. Going back a little bit again, you noted that mediators often will propose the rules and procedures. I'd like to ask, are there instances in which a party might put forward a first draft of rules and procedures instead?
Yeah, Nicole, the expectation is that the mediator puts forward the rules of procedure, the code of conduct. But every party that I've worked with, I've advised that they get their draft on top first of the rules of procedure for a variety of reasons. One, it helps that delegation or the delegation that I'm advising develop their own process for putting words on paper. When you come to putting words on paper about a ceasefire or about fiscal federalism, it's pretty intense. Rules of negotiation are pretty mundane, but it's in a sense a practice run for the delegation that I'm working with to suss out how do they as a delegation craft a position and put it on the paper. It also creates the expectation that they will be engaged at every dimension of the process. Oftentimes, if you're representing one of the weaker parties, the government will be in a position and have the resources to put drafts on the table. They'll seize the initiative. The mediator there's an expectation that the mediator puts things on the table. And there's oftentimes an expectation that the civilian delegation or the non-state armed actors, they're novices at this. They're rookies. So we don't have to worry about that. If the rookies show up, if the civilian delegation shows up and boom, has a draft rules of procedure, they're signaling that they are in the game and they will be putting their drafts on top first. If not, they'll be having a draft for the issues that come through. It's also important in order to create parity The mediator will try to draft rules that create parity. But if you're working with a delegation that doesn't have the same access to resources that either the mediator does or the opposing delegation, you're going to want to craft the rules in a way that they empower your delegation, that they create parity. Oftentimes, the delegations that I work with, one of their rules is to be able to have access to international experts. And the government will always say that's an infringement on sovereignty and political independence. And the non-state armed actors are going to say, you have an entire government that you can tap into for substantive knowledge. We're non-state armed actors. We're tapping into our diaspora. We're tapping into international experts to provide us with guidance and assistance. And we want the rule to say that's okay so that we can establish parity in the negotiation room. And so you'll want to use these rules and procedures to preemptively blunt the tricks of the trade that the opposing party is going to use to inhibit your ability to effectively represent your constituents' interests in the peace process.
That's so strategic. So we've covered creating the rules and procedures, who is creating them, what they look like, what happens when you break them. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I would just like to remind those that are preparing for peace negotiations and going into negotiations that you will almost certainly forget how important the rules of procedure and the behavioral code of conduct is, probably as soon as you finish listening to this podcast, because you'll be thinking about security sector reform and the state structure. And are we doing symmetrical or asymmetrical federalism? But really take a beat before you go into those negotiations. Spend some time working on this very mundane task of designing rules of procedure. It's the first thing your delegation is going to do together. It's the first piece of paper you're going to put on the table, and it governs the entire process. And you don't want to be in the 45th day of a negotiation and think, oh, wow, we really should have structured the operations of this negotiation differently because we're at a perpetual disadvantage because we adopted the rules of the mediator or we didn't have our say. So get in early on the rules of procedure. Yep, they are mundane, but they can create parity and they can help your delegation leverage its full potential.
Really great stuff, Bo. Thank you so much for taking this time to discuss the rules and procedures for negotiating peace agreements. Like you mentioned, it can be mundane, but it's so important to cover and to have a really good grasp on. I look forward to our future conversations as we continue to explore the various aspects of and considerations for negotiating. Thank you so much and talk soon.
Thank you, Nicole.